Imagine a world without iPhones, MacBooks, or even Pixar movies. Hard to believe, right? But what if I told you that one man's obsession with perfection, his ruthless ambition, and his relentless vision shaped the way we live today? This is the story of Steve Jobs, a genius, a rebel, a visionary who changed technology, entertainment, and business forever. But behind his success was a journey filled with failures, betrayals, and an uncompromising pursuit of excellence. A journey that turned Apple from a garage startup into the most valuable company in the world. Today on BookBlink, we bring you the audiobook-style summary of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. A gripping, no-nonsense look into the life of a man who refused to settle for anything less than perfection. This isn't just a story about Apple, it's a story about innovation, obsession, and the price of greatness. Stay till the end, because this one might just change the way you see the world. Steve Jobs, A Visionary's Journey. Part 1. In 2003, Steve Jobs sat in a doctor's office, listening to words that would change his life forever. The scan had revealed a tumor in his pancreas. The doctor explained that most pancreatic cancers were fatal. Jobs, known for his obsession with control, now faced something he couldn't dictate. But in typical Steve Jobs fashion, he refused to accept the prognosis at face value. Instead, he embarked on a journey of alternative treatments, resisting surgery for months because he believed he could outthink even death. This moment, one of defiance, one of belief in his own instincts, was the essence of Steve Jobs. He wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature, someone who bent reality to his will. But how did he become this way? How did a college dropout, abandoned by his birth parents, grow into the visionary who changed the world? To understand Steve Jobs, we have to go back to the very beginning. A child destined for greatness. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 to a young, unwed couple, Joanne Schiebel and Abdul Fattah Jandali. But before he could even form a memory, he was given up for adoption. His biological mother wanted him placed in a family of intellectuals, but the chosen couple backed out at the last minute. Instead, a working-class couple, Paul and Clara Jobs, took him in. Joanne was hesitant. Paul hadn't even graduated high school, but he and Clara promised that Steve would go to college. Only then did she sign the adoption papers. From the beginning, Steve's parents told him something that shaped his identity forever. You are special. You were chosen. But Steve interpreted it in his own way. Instead of feeling abandoned, he felt destined. A curious and rebellious mind. Growing up in Silicon Valley, Steve's childhood was shaped by two things: his father's craftsmanship and the technological revolution happening around him. Paul Jobs was a machinist, a man who took pride in precision. He taught Steve that what's inside a product matters as much as what's on the outside. This lesson would stick with him for life. But Steve wasn't an easy child. He was brilliant, but defiant. At school, he was a troublemaker. He found the structured system boring, often pulling pranks and challenging teachers. Yet, when given the right motivation, he could immerse himself completely. Then came a turning point. His fourth-grade teacher, Imogene Hill. She saw his potential and bribed him with candy and cash to do assignments. It worked. Steve excelled so much that he was offered the chance to skip 2 grades. His parents compromised on 1. Meeting Steve Wozniak, the beginning of a revolution. As Jobs grew older, his interests expanded. He was drawn to electronics, and soon he met a kindred spirit, Steve Wozniak. Woz was a shy, brilliant engineer, someone who could build anything. He had a love for technology, but unlike Jobs, he didn't have the ambition to turn ideas into products. Their friendship would become the foundation of Apple. Their first venture? A prank. Woz built a blue box, a device that could hack phone networks and allow people to make free calls. The two Steves tested it by calling the Vatican, pretending to be Henry Kissinger. It was a glimpse of their dynamic. Woz, the technical genius, Jobs, the charismatic salesman. They made and sold blue boxes to students, earning a small fortune. But more importantly, Jobs saw the potential. Technology could be more than just a hobby, it could be a business. This realization would soon lead to the creation of something far bigger than either of them had imagined. Steve Jobs, A Visionary's Journey. Part 2. The College Dropout Who Wanted More. Steve Jobs had fulfilled his mother's wish. He went to college. But he quickly realized it wasn't for him. Reed College was expensive, and he hated the structured curriculum. He felt guilty that his parents were spending their life savings on something he found meaningless. So, after just 6 months, he dropped out. But instead of leaving Reed entirely, Jobs stayed on campus, sleeping on friends' floors, returning Coke bottles for food money, and sneaking into classes that actually interested him. One of those was a calligraphy class. It seemed useless at the time, but years later it would shape the typography of the Macintosh and ultimately personal computers worldwide. Looking back, Jobs would say, "You can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward." A journey to India and a search for meaning. After leaving Reed, Jobs felt lost. He craved something deeper than technology, something spiritual. So, in 1974, he traveled to India with a friend, searching for enlightenment. He shaved his head, walked barefoot, and adopted a strict vegetarian diet. He learned about intuition, simplicity, and the power of the mind. But after months in rural India, he realized something. Spirituality alone wouldn't fulfill him. He admired the Zen philosophy of minimalism, but he wasn't meant to be a monk. He was meant to create. When he returned to California, he was more focused than ever. He got a job at Atari, one of the first video game companies. He wasn't an engineer, but he had an intensity that made him stand out. He worked night shifts, avoided showers, and obsessed over design. It was here that he truly honed his perfectionism. He demanded that things be simple, elegant, and intuitive. But Jobs wasn't meant to work for someone else. He was meant to build something of his own. The birth of Apple. In a garage. By the mid-70s, computers were massive machines, used only by corporations and scientists. No one thought they could be personal. No one except Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Woz had built a prototype of a small personal computer. It was a hobby, a passion project. But Jobs saw something more. He saw a product that could revolutionize the world. With no money and no investors, they started Apple in Steve's parents' garage. The two Steves were an odd pair. Woz was the brilliant engineer. Jobs was the visionary and salesman. He convinced local electronics stores to buy their first computers, secured funding, and turned Apple from a garage project into a real company. Then came Apple's first real product, the Apple II. Unlike anything before it, it had a simple design and a built-in color display. It wasn't just for tech geeks, it was for regular people. And when it launched in 1977, it was a massive success. Apple was no longer a small startup, it was a revolution in the making. The rise of a perfectionist. As Apple grew, so did Jobs' intensity. He demanded perfection. Every product had to be beautiful inside and out. Every detail mattered. Employees feared his brutal criticism, but they also admired his vision. He had a unique ability to push people beyond what they thought possible. But his obsession also made him difficult. He would walk barefoot in the office, meditate in meetings, and fire employees on the spot if they didn't meet his expectations. He wasn't just building computers, he was building art. And if something wasn't perfect, it wasn't good enough. Apple was on its way to becoming the biggest tech company in the world. But Steve Jobs' relentless pursuit of perfection would soon lead to his downfall. Steve Jobs, A Visionary's Journey. Part 3. The Battle for the Future, Macintosh versus IBM. By the early 1980s, Apple was booming. The Apple II had made personal computers mainstream, and the company was worth millions. But Steve Jobs wasn't satisfied. He wanted something even bigger, something that would change the world forever. His vision? The Macintosh. At the time, IBM was dominating the computer industry. They were a corporate giant, and Apple was the rebellious underdog. Jobs saw IBM as the enemy, the symbol of outdated, soulless technology. Apple, on the other hand, represented creativity, innovation, and revolution. And so, Jobs assembled a small, secretive team to build the Macintosh. He handpicked each person, demanding absolute dedication. He told them, "We are inventing the future." But working with Jobs was brutal. He was relentless, pushing his team beyond their limits. He would tell engineers their work was garbage and demand they start over. He obsessed over every detail, down to the font on the screen. He didn't just want a computer, he wanted a work of art. After years of development, the Macintosh was finally ready. And in 1984, Jobs introduced it to the world in one of the most legendary product launches in history. The 1984 Super Bowl ad, a declaration of war. To announce the Macintosh, Apple aired a Super Bowl commercial unlike anything the world had ever seen. Directed by Ridley Scott, it showed a dystopian world controlled by a Big Brother figure, symbolizing IBM. Suddenly, a young woman ran in and smashed the screen with a hammer, breaking IBM's control. The ad ended with the words, "On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh." And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. It was a declaration of war. Apple was here to challenge the status quo. The rise and fall of Steve Jobs. The launch of the Macintosh was electrifying. When Jobs took the stage, he did something no CEO had ever done. He let the Mac introduce itself. The computer spoke to the audience, and they erupted in applause. The Mac was revolutionary, beautiful, user-friendly, and ahead of its time. But there was a problem. It was too expensive and underpowered compared to IBM's machines. Sales didn't meet expectations, and Apple executives started questioning Jobs' leadership. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a power struggle was brewing. Jobs had brought in John Sculley, the CEO of Pepsi, to help run Apple. At first they got along, but soon their visions clashed. Jobs was a dreamer, an artist. Sculley was a businessman who cared about profits. Tensions reached a breaking point in 1985. Apple's board of directors had to make a choice. Steve Jobs or John Sculley? They chose Sculley. And just like that, Steve Jobs, the man who had built Apple from nothing, was forced out of his own company. At just 30 years old, Jobs had lost everything. He was humiliated, heartbroken, and furious. But what no one realized was that this wasn't the end of Steve Jobs. It was just the beginning of his greatest comeback. Steve Jobs, A Visionary's Journey. Part 4. Lost but not defeated. Steve Jobs was devastated. He had built Apple from a garage startup into a multi-million-dollar company, only to be thrown out of his own creation. The world saw him as a failure, a brilliant but reckless leader who had been outmaneuvered by corporate executives. But deep down, Jobs knew something they didn't. He was just getting started. Instead of giving up, he did what he had always done. He started building again. Next, a new beginning. In 1985, Jobs founded a new company, Next Computer. His goal? To build the world's most advanced workstation for education and business. He poured his heart into Next, obsessing over every detail. The computers were beautiful, crafted from magnesium with a sleek, minimalist design. The software was revolutionary, but there was a problem. It was too expensive. Next computers were a technical masterpiece, but no one could afford them. The company struggled to gain traction, and sales were disappointing. It seemed like Jobs was failing again. But behind the scenes, something incredible was happening. The Next operating system was light years ahead of its time. Engineers and developers loved it. And though the hardware would eventually fail, the software would play a crucial role in Jobs' comeback. Pixar turning cartoons into gold. At the same time, Jobs made another bold move. He bought a small animation studio from George Lucas for $5 million. The company? Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled. They were a group of brilliant artists and engineers, but no one in Hollywood believed computer animation could work. Jobs kept funding the company, even when it seemed hopeless. He was bleeding money. Then, in 1995, everything changed. Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first fully computer-animated film. It was a massive hit, redefining animation forever. Jobs took Pixar public, and overnight, his $5 million investment became worth over $1.5 billion. Steve Jobs, once seen as a failure, was now a Hollywood mogul. Apple's downfall, and a surprise twist. While Jobs was building Next and Pixar, Apple was falling apart. Without its visionary leader, the company had lost its edge. Competitors like Microsoft and Dell were dominating the industry. Apple's products were uninspired, slow, and outdated. Sales were plummeting, and the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, in 1996, something unexpected happened. Apple needed a new operating system, one that was modern and powerful. And the best option? Next's software. So, in a shocking twist, Apple bought Next for $400 million, and with it, they got Steve Jobs back. The return of the king. At first, Jobs returned as an advisor, but within months he took back control of the company he had founded. Apple was dying, and Jobs knew it. His first move? Slashing 70% of Apple's products. He fired entire teams, killed unnecessary projects, and focused only on what mattered. His philosophy was simple. Deciding what not to do is just as important as deciding what to do. Then he made an even bolder decision, partnering with his old enemy, Microsoft. At Macworld 1997, Jobs stood on stage and announced a $150 million investment from Bill Gates. The audience booed, but Jobs didn't care. He knew Apple needed cash to survive. Slowly, Apple began to rise again, but it would take one final masterstroke to bring the company back to life. The iMac. Steve Jobs, a visionary's journey. Part 5. The iMac, Apple's comeback. Begins when Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997. The company was in shambles. It was losing money, its products were outdated, and many believed it wouldn't survive. But Jobs had a plan, a product that would save Apple and change the way people saw computers. That product was the iMac. Jobs wanted to create a computer that was fun, beautiful, and simple to use. He worked with Jony Ive, a young designer at Apple, to make something completely different from the dull, beige computers of the time. The result? A bold, colorful, all-in-one machine that looked like nothing else on the market. It was translucent, had rounded edges, and came in bright colors like blue, orange, and green. But it wasn't just about looks. The iMac was designed for everyday people, not just tech geeks. It was fast, easy to set up, and connected to the internet in seconds. Something that was still complicated on other computers. When Jobs unveiled it, he brought back his signature storytelling. He didn't just list technical specs. He showed the experience. He made people fall in love with the product before they even touched it. The result? The iMac became a sensation. It sold millions of units, brought Apple back to profitability, and proved that Jobs still had his magic touch. But this was only the beginning. The digital hub strategy, Jobs' big vision. Most people thought Apple was just a computer company, but Jobs saw something much bigger. He believed the future wasn't just about PCs, it was about how all devices connected together. He called this idea the digital hub. His vision? Apple would create not just computers, but a whole ecosystem of products that worked seamlessly together. First, he launched the iPod, a tiny, revolutionary music player that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. Then came iTunes, which let people buy and organize their music legally at a time when piracy was killing the music industry. Jobs didn't just create products, he changed entire industries. And yet, he was about to do something even bigger, something that would change the world forever. The iPhone, reinventing the future. By the early 2000s, mobile phones were everywhere, but they were clunky, with tiny keyboards and terrible software. Most people thought phones and computers were completely separate things. But Jobs? He saw an opportunity. He wanted to create a device that was not just a phone, but a revolution. Something that combined a phone, an iPod, and the internet into one sleek device. The result? The iPhone. It was a phone with no buttons, just a beautiful touchscreen that responded to your fingers. It let you browse the web, send emails, and listen to music, all in one device. When Jobs unveiled it in 2007, he held the audience in awe. He walked them through the experience, showing them how the iPhone was not just another phone, it was the future. The reaction? People went crazy. The iPhone shattered expectations, sold millions, and turned Apple into the most powerful tech company in the world. Jobs had done it again, but behind the scenes, a battle was raging, one that even Steve Jobs couldn't control. Steve Jobs, a visionary's journey. Part 6. The battle behind the scenes. On the outside, Steve Jobs seemed unstoppable. The iMac had saved Apple, the iPod had revolutionized music, and the iPhone was changing the world. But behind the scenes, Jobs was fighting a battle he couldn't win, one against his own body. In 2003, doctors discovered something shocking. Steve Jobs had pancreatic cancer. But in typical Jobs fashion, he refused to accept it. The doctors told him he needed immediate surgery, but Jobs, always a believer in alternative thinking, ignored their advice. He tried special diets, herbal treatments, and even spiritual healing. For 9 months, he avoided surgery. But by the time he finally agreed, the cancer had spread. Even as he fought his illness, Jobs never slowed down. He pushed Apple forward with relentless energy, launching new products that would shape the future. The iPad, a new revolution. In 2010, Jobs walked onto the stage once again, thinner, weaker, but still full of fire. He held up a thin, sleek tablet and said, "This changes everything." The iPad was born. At the time, people laughed at the idea of a giant touchscreen tablet. Critics called it a bigger iPhone with no purpose. But Jobs knew better. The iPad wasn't just a device, it was the future of computing. It replaced laptops for millions of people, became a tool for artists, writers, and professionals. And once again, Apple dominated an entire new industry. Even as his body weakened, Jobs' vision remained sharp. He had turned Apple into the most valuable company in the world. But he knew his time was running out. The farewell. By 2011, Jobs' health was rapidly declining. His once powerful voice had grown weak. He could no longer appear at every product launch. On August 24, 2011, Steve Jobs did something unthinkable. He resigned as CEO of Apple. In his final message, he wrote, "I have always said that if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." Apple was his life's work, and now he had to let it go. 2 months later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs took his final breath. The world lost a genius, a rebel, a visionary. But his legacy? That would never die. The legacy of Steve Jobs. Today, Steve Jobs' influence is everywhere. The iPhone changed how we communicate. The MacBook redefined laptops. The App Store created an entire digital economy. Pixar turned animation into an art form. And Apple? It became the most valuable company on the planet. Jobs wasn't just an inventor. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a storyteller, a dreamer, a man who believed in the impossible and made it real. And maybe that's the greatest lesson he left behind. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Steve Jobs wasn't just a businessman, he was a force of nature. He changed the way we communicate, work, and even think. His journey was filled with genius, failures, and relentless ambition. But in the end, he proved that one person with a vision can change the world. If this story inspired you, make sure to subscribe to Book Blink for more powerful audiobook summaries that bring life's greatest lessons straight to you. Because sometimes, one book can change everything. See you in the next one. Blast off.